Final Fantasy VII, easily one of my favourite games of all time and indisputably one of the most significant releases of the late 1990s. I absolutely adore this title, which is why I've already made more videos about it than Sephiroth has mummy issues, and typically these uploads perform exceptionally well. However, there's always a however, isn't there? You see, while the view counts soar, the comment section on these videos are a very different story indeed. Without fail, they are stacked to the brim with misery, pessimism, mean-spiritedness, bitterness, and a frankly astonishing concentration of antisocial grumbling. Compared to the rest of my uploads, it's like wandering into a digital version of Wallmarket's back alley, a carnival of keyboard combatants all seemingly desperate to out-angst one another. Holding these thoughts, it would be easy, far too easy to fall back on the old stereotype that JRPG fans are just socially stunted, basement-dwelling melancholics who believe emotional investment means frothing rage at polygonal love triangles. But that wouldn't be fair to basement-dwelling melancholics. No, this is something far more specific, because the strange truth is that while all Final Fantasy games attract a loyal and vocal fanbase, there is no fandom quite as bizarre, combative, and downright exhausting as the one that surrounds Final Fantasy VII. And that is what today's video is about. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Let's explore the often tragic, yet sometimes hilarious issues of the Final Fantasy VII fandom. Now, the Final Fantasy franchise, particularly dear old number 7, has sparked more debates than a chocobo has feathers. But if there's one thing we can all agree on, is this: cheap games are marvellous. Whether you're a crusty old purist clinging to your active time battles or a wide-eyed modernist enthralled by flashy action RPG mechanics, you'll be pleased to know that you can get over 50% off both the original Final Fantasy VII and the brand new PC version of Rebirth using my links below. But it gets even better. There are hefty discounts available on practically every Final Fantasy title ever released, plus hundreds of other games, including this year's turn-based surprise hit, the thoroughly excellent Expedition 33. So click the link in the pinned comment, grab yourself a bargain, and treat your wallet like Square Enix treats continuity. Recklessly, but with style. Happy shopping. Long before Final Fantasy VII turned fans into full-blown warlords armed with shipping charts and sharpened Reddit swords, the world of Final Fantasy was a far simpler, gentler place. Picture it. The year is 1987, shoulder pads are enormous, cassette tapes are king, and the very first Final Fantasy graces the NES like a pixelated miracle. From that humble turn-based beginning emerged a series that changed faces more often than a cosplay convention. Each new entry brought a fresh setting, new mechanics, and an entirely different cast, thus meaning you could jump in at any point in the series. By the early 90s, the franchise had inspired a patchwork of loyalists, each convinced their Final Fantasy was the one true gospel. The Final Fantasy IV crowd championed tragic paladins, an unnecessarily complex family drama. Final Fantasy V purists worshipped the job system like it was a commandment, and Final Fantasy VI acolytes practically insisted Kefka was a postmodern Shakespearean villain because nothing says high art like a clown laughing while poisoning an entire kingdom. And yet, for all the squabbles over active time battle versus traditional turns, or whether sprites were superior to polygons, things stayed relatively civil. This was the golden age of what you might call the Patchwork fandom. Each game's fanbase lived in their own little bubble, happily nerding out over their favourite title with the occasional intergame skirmish. It was a time when fans loved Final Fantasy in the way you're supposed to love it, passionately, but with the self-awareness that it's all just a bit of fun. But unfortunately, such peace wouldn't last, because in 1997 the series took a sharp turn, and when that turn came, it led straight into an avalanche of angst, amnesia, and Aerith-related agony that would fracture this once harmonious community beyond recognition forever. In 1997, Final Fantasy didn't just level up, it limit broke the entire gaming industry. With the launch of Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation, the series exploded into the mainstream consciousness, like a meteor spell aimed squarely at your wallet. What had once been a charming JRPG franchise for import weirdos and dungeon masochists suddenly became the most important thing ever. at least according to anyone with a dial-up connection and a GeoCities page titled Cloud Cross Tifa for Life anyway. And to be fair, it was impressive. For the first time, a Final Fantasy game featured cinematic CGI cutscenes, 3D character models complete with chunky mitten hands, and a protagonist with hair so spiky it looked like he tried to headbutt a hedgehog into submission. Cloud Strife was brooding, mysterious, and dragged around a sword the size of a Victorian garden gate. But behind the visual spectacle lurked something far more volatile. Ambiguity. You see, Final Fantasy VII wasn't just a game, it was a narrative puzzle box wrapped in a love triangle, dipped in existential trauma, and launched from a cannon made of unresolved feelings. Cloud didn't know who he was, the players wasn't sure what was real, and most crucially, nobody truly knew who Cloud fancied. Well, apart from in your own playthrough anyway. Enter the affection point system. Unbeknownst to most players early on, Final Fantasy VII was secretly tracking your behaviour, like some passive-aggressive digital cupid assigning invisible scores based on how you treated Tifa, Aerith, Yuffie, or yes, even Barrett. Every choice you made, whether you were nice to Aerith in the church, picked Tifa over the flower girl, or just generally acted like a gruff, emotionally unavailable edgelord, nudged the needle of destiny ever so slightly. Now, while most players ended up on their gold saucer dates with either Tifa or Aerith, depending on how emotionally manipulative they'd been, there was a hidden gem buried in the code, the Barrett Date. Yes, through a bizarre cocktail of callousness, neglect, and sheer determination to act like Andrew Tate on a caffeine bender, you could tell the ladies to get lost often enough to end up alone with Barrett on the gondola. A romantic evening with a man who has a gun for a hand and the patience of a gnat. And what's most hilarious of all, midway through this tender, moonlit moment, Barrett starts accusing Cloud, yes really, of possibly being some kind of paedophile, who's got designs on his daughter Marlene. I'm not making this up. Unsurprisingly, this particular exchange didn't make the cut in Rebirth. Square Enix, for all their fondness for nostalgia, probably thought that maybe implying their protagonist as a kiddie fiddler was a tad much for 2024 sensibilities. Still, for those who grew up playing the original, it remains one of the strangest and most darkly hilarious scenes in RPG history. A landmark moment in representation, or more likely the source of deep confusion for an entire generation of boys who were just trying to unlock Omnislash. Still, for the vast majority of players, the question boiled down to the binary that would go on to consume the fandom: Team Tifa or Team Aerith. And Square, in its infinite chaos, gave you just enough wiggle room to believe that either answer was correct. It was as if the devs poured petrol all over the story, struck a match, and then shouted, "Interpret this however you like." Due to this online, the Gold Saucer Date quickly became the sacred text of this new fandom religion. Thus, the seeds were planted for what would become one of the strangest, most entrenched, and most genuinely exhausting fandom feuds in all of gaming history. So let's dig into the ride of the embarrassing online Final Fantasy VII shipping wars. By the turn of the millennium, Final Fantasy VII fans had taken their affection points and turned them into obsession points. With home internet access on the rise, online forums became the new battlegrounds, not for justice or glory, but to decide once and for all who Cloud should be snogging. And thus the love triangle debate, or LTD if you're one of the uninitiated, probably took root. In one corner, Clotty, the Cloud Tifa shippers who believe love blossoms best between childhood friends and tight tank tops. In the other, Clarith, the Cloud and Aerith loyalists who insisted that trauma bonding in flower fields equated to eternal soulmates. Just for the record, for those viewing who do not live terminally online, if you're unfamiliar with the concept of shipping, it's when fans project their emotional well-being onto whether or not two fictional characters might kiss. And Final Fantasy VII didn't just allow this, it encouraged it. Due to this, fan sites sprouted like digital mushrooms. Some were earnest tributes filled with ASCII art and Weebrings. Others were sprawling temples to shipping supremacy, complete with 10,000-word essays on why Cloud only ever had eyes for Tifa, or how Aerith was his true and canon soulmate, based on something vague he muttered in the Sleeping Forest. And then came the hate shrines. Yes, you heard correctly, hate shrines. There were web pages dedicated to slandering the rival ship's love interest, and these weren't snarky memes or playful jabs, they were unhinged character assassinations wrapped in Comic Sans and blinking red text. According to these pixelated manifestos, Aerith was manipulative, Tifa was abusive. Yuffie was irrelevant. Barrett had the good sense to stop showing up to these forums. Still though, for all the melodrama, most of it lived in the realms of words and pixels. Well, until it didn't. If you thought the shipping war was just nerdy bickering online, think again. In the early 2000s, a group of Final Fantasy VII superfans in Pennsylvania took things to an entirely deranged new level. These people weren't just fans, they believed they were the characters. Literally, they claimed to be soul bonded to Cloud, Sephiroth, even Rufus Shinra for some reason. Unfortunately, I'm not even kidding. This is the insanity of subsections of this deranged fandom. The Final Fantasy VII house was a group of self-proclaimed otherkin, people who genuinely believed they were the reincarnations of, get this, fictional characters, who together formed a little commune of chaos. At the centre of it all, a woman who insisted she was Sephiroth. Not like she related to him, not like she cosplayed him, no, she was him. Reborn in a female body, because apparently even one-winged angels can identify as whatever they liked on LiveJournal. Her name, Jen, but online she called herself Sephiroth Genova, because why stop at just one identity crisis when you can have two? Jen, along with her girlfriend, who claimed to be the real reincarnation of Hojo, yes, the creepy mad scientist who experiments on babies, ran a household where fellow Final Fantasy VII characters had apparently reawakened in the bodies of gullible anime-addled young adults. These poor souls genuinely believed they were Tifa, Vincent, Aerith, Cloud and more. The house itself quickly became a mixture of cult, fandom meltdowns and emotional hostage situations. People were invited to live there, only to be subjected to manipulation, gaslighting, and weird rules like you can't eat meat because Hojo says so, or Cloud isn't allowed to talk to Aerith unless supervised. I wish I was exaggerating, but sadly, all of this is true. In fact, one poor bloke named Zack, or rather a guy who believed or was convinced he was Zack, ended up being psychologically tormented because he didn't sufficiently worship Sephiroth Jen's authority. Honestly, imagine being bullied in real life for your fictional backstory. Well, that was the Final Fantasy VII house. The situation ended up getting so bad that one ex-member wrote a full expose, which later became the stuff of internet legend. It revealed everything from the absurd roleplay hierarchies to the emotional manipulation and flat-out abuse. People online read the documents, laughed, cried, and collectively went, Jesus Christ, I just wanted to level up my limit breaks. In hindsight, the Final Fantasy VII house is less a fandom curiosity and more a cautionary tale about what happens when fantasy meets untreated mental illness and then gets Wi-Fi, and yet somehow it's still less toxic than some modern fan spaces. If the original Final Fantasy VII was a game, then what followed in the mid-2000s was a multimedia feeding frenzy, a buffet of spin-offs, prequels, sequels, anime shorts, and one very moody CGI movie with more black leather than a German techno club. Sensing they'd struck gold with Cloud and company, Square Enix launched a compilation of Final Fantasy VII. This included Advent Children, the CGI sequel where nobody buttons a shirt, smiles or eats anything. Crisis Core, the heartfelt prequel that retroactively made Zack Fair's gaming's most tragically swoonable man, Dirge Cerberus, the brooding third-person shooter that gave Vincent Valentine his own personal emo apocalypse, and a smattering of books, novellas, phone games, and obscure web content no one could quite remember if they'd played or hallucinated. Now, in theory, the compilation was meant to clarify things, offer closure, define canon, but instead it unleashed chaos. Every new entry seemed less like an answer and more like an open-ended riddle. The love triangle, still unresolved. Cloud's mental health, somehow worse. Sephiroth, somehow more shirtless, and instead of tying the story together, the compilation fractured it even further, creating what could only be described as a multiverse of maybes. Take Crisis Core, it positions Zack as Aerith's one true love. Cue the Clerics celebrating, but then Advent Children arrived, giving us a chronically miserable Cloud living with Tifa and staring sadly into middle distance clotty heaven. Then someone on Game FAQs unearthed a blink and you'll miss it line in a Japanese-only novella that contradicted both interpretations, and we were all back to square one. The result, everyone could be right, and nobody could prove it. A dream scenario for shippers, a nightmare for anyone hoping the series might one day commit to an answer. And what made this worse is that all of this happened just as social media began to take over. Forums gave way to blogs, live journal drama oozed into MySpace, then got weaponized on Facebook and Twitter. The shipping wars officially entered real time. Now, instead of stewing quietly on their own fan sites, the weirdos could ratio someone publicly for daring to suggest that Tifa deserves better. Tumblr tags were hijacked, meta essays were reposted with venom, flame wars turned nuclear, and somewhere in the digital din, people stopped talking about the actual story and started behaving as if they were part of it. The tragedy of Aerith irrelevant, the ecological message forgotten. What really mattered now was whether Cloud's famously clenched backside in Advent Children was tense from grief over Aerith, or because he was living with Tifa in awkward post-traumatic silence. The compilation was supposed to be a gift, a celebration. Instead, it became a hall of mirrors, a never-ending, increasingly unhinged argument over who Cloud's pixelated heart truly belonged to. But of course, not everyone was busy drawing kissy fan art and decoding drama CDs like they were the Dead Sea Scrolls. No, for a sizable chunk of the Final Fantasy VII fandom, particularly those who played the original when it launched in 1997, the compilation wasn't just unnecessary, it was sacrilege. To these fans, Final Fantasy VII wasn't just a game, it was a self-contained, melancholic, oddly polygonal masterpiece. It told a complete story, beginning, middle, end. Cloud had an arc, Aerith died, Sephiroth exploded in space, job done, roll credits. But then years later, along came Square Enix, rubbing their hands together like Shimmer executives sniffing Mako profits, ready to dig up the grave, sometimes literally, and wring the legacy dry. Suddenly, the tightly wound ambiguity of the original was being chopped up and sold for parts. Why let Cloud rest when you can turn him into a CGI action figure who broods for 93 minutes and solves problems with anime flips? Why leave Sephiroth dead when you can bring him back through clones of clones, memory ghosts and spiritual cousins called Deep Ground that no sane person ever asked for? To many, the compilation didn't expand the story, it hollowed it out. What was once haunting became overwrought. What was poetic became pedestrian. What was beautifully vague, Cloud's trauma, Aerith's fate, even Shinra's fall, became codified, clarified, and monetized. And worst of all, it looked like a cash grab. Because it was. This was a distinct shift at Square Enix during the 2000s, where the artistry of storytelling took a back seat to how many SKUs can we ship this quarter. Final Fantasy VII wasn't revisited out of reverence, it was strip mined for parts. Zack got a prequel, Vincent got a shooter, Cloud got 17 new belts and a motorcycle that looked like it was designed by a Hot Topic manager, and the fans, they got whiplash. Dirge of Cerberus in particular became the poster child for this backlash. A moody, half-baked shooter starring a character who was cool precisely because he was mysterious. Now starring in his very own third-person gunfest, it was like giving Silent Bob a TED Talk. The whole appeal was that he didn't say much. Now he wouldn't shut up. Meanwhile, Advent Children was beautiful but empty, like watching your favourite band reform, only to play a 90-minute ambient jazz remix of their biggest hit while standing in the rain. It looked like Final Fantasy VII, it sounded like Final Fantasy VII, but somehow it wasn't Final Fantasy VII. And so a schism formed. On one side you had the compilation apologists, piecing together every new fragment and calling it lore. On the other, the purists, arms crossed, discs in hand, muttering, it was perfect the first time. To them, Square Enix hadn't honoured the legacy. They'd slapped a brand on it and run it through a sequel sausage machine. For these players, the compilation didn't just add content, it cheapened the emotional impact of the original. It turned a powerful, self-contained story about grief, identity and sacrifice into a sprawling franchise about anime boys doing backflips on motorcycles while growling cryptic nonsense into the rain. To many, Final Fantasy VII had gone from tragedy to fan service, and for those who held the original close to their hearts, it wasn't just disappointment, it was personal. Yet somehow, things were only going to get worse. By the 2010s, platforms like Twitter, YouTube and Tumblr began tailoring your feed based on what you raged the most about, which in fandom terms usually meant someone calling Aerith a manipulative corpse or Tifa a gaslighting dominatrix. One angry click and suddenly your timeline was flooded with people screaming slightly louder than you about how the other side was delusional, abusive, or canonically illiterate. These echo chambers didn't just amplify, they entrenched. What had started as a silly argument over a theme park date turned into a digital war zone, filled with memes, meta-essays, and grainy screenshots of Cloud's eyebrows allegedly proving his true romantic intentions. Yes, that actually happened. Meanwhile, long-term harassers began to emerge. These weren't just angry fans, these were career shippers, people who had been arguing the same point since the dial-up era, and had now evolved into full-blown engagement predators. By this point, the toxicity wasn't a weird corner of the fandom, it was baked in, and quietly, uncomfortably, even Square Enix themselves began to take notice. Developers who once chuckled about fans bickering over the Highwind scene now found themselves staring down tsunami waves of DMs, quote tweets, and unhinged fan petitions demanding justice, confirmation, or disturbingly often, character deaths. And if you think I'm exaggerating, allow me to present Exhibit A, Kazushigi Nima, the original scenario writer for Final Fantasy VII. Nojima, a man whose writing credits include everything from Crisis Core to Advent Children to Final Fantasy X, once made the grave mistake of posting a wholesome photo of his pet guinea pig on Twitter. Just a simple, innocent update from a man who helped define an entire generation of RPG storytelling. Within hours, the replies were flooded, not with cute comments or fan appreciation, but with fans demanding to know why he hadn't killed Tifa yet. According to Japanese fans chronicling the incident, Nojima's replies were hijacked by angry Clariff shippers, who had somehow decided that the existence of Tifa Lockhart was an affront to all that was good and pure in the world. The guinea pig? Forgotten. The fandom completely divorced from reality. This wasn't a one-off either. Nojima has remained largely silent on social media most of the time, only occasionally appearing through carefully curated PR materials. Because who wouldn't go radio silent after posting a picture of your pets and being asked why your fictional woman murder count was still too low? And Nojima wasn't alone. Other staff involved in the series, such as Motomu Toriyama, have spoken in interviews about their surprise at how feral the shipping discourse has become, noting that modern fans are far more assertive than those in the 90s. Assertive, of course, being polite Japanese corporate code for "please stop emailing us death threats about the livestream." So yes, the people who work on this series, the ones who shape these characters, can't even post about their pets without being harassed by strange players who think they're defending the honour of a dead flower girl. What a time to be alive! But as crazy as some of this is, the remake will of course bring with it even more division. By 2020, the fandom had aged like fine wine, if that wine had been left open on a radiator for 15 years and topped up occasionally with monster energy and tears. After decades of arguing, theorizing, and photoshopping Cloud's facial expressions into emotional confessionals, the unthinkable happened. Final Fantasy VII Remake was real, and it was here. Fans rejoiced everywhere, well, for about 7 minutes at least. Because while Remake brought stunning visuals, a tighter Midgar narrative, and a combat system that finally let you punch ghosts in glorious HD, it also did something far more volatile. It cracked open the shipping war all over again, like an ancient tomb that someone had specifically warned not to disturb. Rather than clarifying the love triangle, Remake deliberately doubled down on the ambiguity. But it wasn't just the fans tearing each other to pieces this time, it was developers themselves who became targets. The very people who made the game started getting bombarded with accusations of leading us on, betraying canon, or in a move that can only be described as emotionally deranged, erasing our childhoods. We have already covered the bizarre incident online that involved a guinea pig and Nojima, but this was the tip of the iceberg. Cody Christian, the new voice of Cloud, had the audacity to mention that maybe, not definitely, just maybe, not every single emotional interaction needs to be overtly sexualized. This predictably caused a meltdown. One side accused him of suppressing representation, the other called him a fake fan. Some fans were so angry you'd think he'd cancelled Christmas. Meanwhile, Brianna White, the voice of Aerith, made the mistake of trying to calm everyone down, suggesting naively that they were all a family and we should maybe not destroy each other over shipping drama. Naturally, this went down about as well as telling a bar fight to stop mid-bottle swing because we're all mates here. The sheer emotional energy radiating off the internet during the remake period could have powered Midgar for a decade, and yet no one seemed happy. Not really, because the truth is, Remake wasn't designed to end an argument. It was designed to preserve it, like a carefully bottled storm shaken and re-released for a new generation. But of course the retardation that surrounded the shipping debate was just a small fraction of anger that existed in the splintered Final Fantasy VII fandom, so let's dig even deeper. Many fans of the original Final Fantasy VII were angry that Final Fantasy VII Remake even existed, and not in the fun I'm going to post about this on Game FAQs kind of way. We're talking genuinely betrayed, pacing around the room angry. To them, the remake wasn't a celebration of a beloved classic. It was a corporate Trojan horse stuffed with Kingdom Hearts logic, anime nonsense, and an entirely new plot that nobody had asked for. At the heart of the outrage was a simple fact. Final Fantasy VII Remake wasn't actually a remake. It was a reinvention, a meta-sequel in disguise. What started as a faithful reimagining of the 1997 classic eventually swerved hard into fourth wall-breaking territory, introducing time-travelling ghost wraiths known as Whispers, who exist solely to preserve destiny. This twist confused and infuriated many players who just wanted a shinier version of the game they loved, not a philosophical debate on determinism wrapped in Nomura's usual cryptic riddles. Pacing also became a major sticking point. The original game blasted through Midgar in 5 hours. Remake stretched it into a 40-hour odyssey, padded with side quests, busy work, and the occasional help the orphans find their missing cat diversion. What was once a tight, gritty opening act became a bloated, overproduced tour of Sector 7's least interesting alleyways. For some, it was rich world building. For others, it felt like Square Enix was stalling for time while preparing the next £60 installment. Combat was another divisive topic. The turn-based purists weren't exactly thrilled to discover that the traditional ATB system had been replaced with flashy real-time action, complete with slow-motion menus and character swapping. While some praised the hybrid approach, others felt that Remake had abandoned the strategic depth and pacing that defined the original. Suddenly it wasn't about careful planning, it was about dodging at the right time and hoping your AI companions didn't fall asleep during boss fights. Even Cloud's character came under scrutiny. In the original, his personality was cold, standoffish, and emotionally distant, a facade that slowly unravelled over time. But in Remake, many felt Cloud was far too sociable, too flirty, too charming. Instead of watching a broken man slowly open up, players were treated to a surprisingly well-adjusted himbo, doing squats with gym bros, while Aerith swooned in the background. Character development? More like character acceleration. Then there was the tone. Remake was, for a lack of a better word, extremely anime. Over-the-top scenes, slow-motion acrobatics, cackling villains on motorbikes. Many fans found it jarring when compared to the grittier tone of the original. One standout example, the introduction of Roach, a one-off motorcycle rival with the energy of a rejected My Hero Academia villain. Cool in theory, confusing in execution. Of course, perhaps the biggest punch to the gut for old school fans was the realization that this game was only part 1. After 20 years of waiting, they were given one city, 1/3 of a story, one full-priced game with no clear roadmap or confirmed number of entries. Players quickly began to feel like Square Enix was stringing them along, milking their nostalgia one £60 chunk at a time. And let's not forget the looming shadow of over-monetization. Given Square Enix's well-earned reputation for squeezing every last drop out of a franchise, be it via gacha games, deluxe editions, or DLC costumes, many fans assumed this trilogy would end up costing them hundreds just to see the ending they already paid for back in 1997. Worse still, the remake leaned heavily on outside lore. Understanding who Zack Fair was, why he mattered, or what on earth was going on in that ending scene often required playing Crisis Core, as well as reading obscure novellas or scouring fans' translated interviews from 2006. To the uninitiated, it felt less like a standalone game and more like homework. All in all, Final Fantasy VII Remake managed to upset a hell of a lot of people. Traditionalists, shippers, combat purists, story lovers, and even casual fans. For every player enchanted by its visuals and ambition, there was another left bewildered, betrayed, or just plain exhausted. And as we now know, with Rebirth, the rabbit hole only gets deeper. If Final Fantasy VII Remake was a divisive opening salvo, then Rebirth was a full-blown cannonball into the fandom's already fragile psyche. Square Enix promised an epic continuation, grander in scope, deeper in emotion and truer to the original, and to their credit, it was bigger. There were open zones, chocobo wrangling, mini-games galore, and more lore than you could shake a Buster Sword at. But for many fans, Rebirth didn't fix the problems, it amplified them. The story, for one, managed to get even more abstract. If players were baffled by the whispers of fate in Remake, Rebirth cranked the metaphysics up to 11. We're now dealing with time travel implications, alternate timelines, multiverse doppelgangers, and characters who may or may not be dead depending on how many JPEG in the plot. Rebirth danced gleefully into ambiguity and dared you to keep up. One of the most contentious plot twists was the return of Zack Fair. In the original canon, Zack's tragic death gave Cloud's entire identity arc its emotional weight. In Rebirth, Zack is alive, kind of, somewhere, and in a different timeline. Maybe. Possibly also a hallucination. His reappearance is barely explained and left deliberately vague, leading many fans to accuse the developers of undermining one of the most powerful moments in Final Fantasy history just to yank a few tears out of unsuspecting players. Then there's the Aerith problem. For over 2 decades, fans braced themselves to relive her iconic death, the moment that cemented the original game's emotional legacy, but Rebirth couldn't leave well enough alone. Instead of committing to her fate, the game delivers a surreal half-death sequence wrapped in metaphysical confusion. Is she alive, dead, dreaming, time-looped? Nobody knows. What should have been a gut punch became a blurry narrative shrug. You had one job, came the chorus line. Just kill her properly. The expanded world also became a point of contention. While the open zones looked lovely, many fans found them bloated and padded. Repetitive fetch quests, mini-games that overstayed their welcome, and bizarre tonal swings. One minute you're reflecting on trauma, the next you're catching frogs, creating a sense of dissonance. What was once a tight, emotionally focused story now felt like a bloated JRPG checklist with a plot occasionally woven in between chocobo time trials. And then we come to perhaps the most radioactive core of the entire Final Fantasy VII Rebirth fallout, the romance. To say that Rebirth reimagined the shipping wars would be an understatement, because while the original game flirted with ambiguity, Rebirth was seen by many as finally tilting the scale hard in Tifa's favour. And this was the moment everything caught fire. For years, the Clarith camp had clung to emotional moments, wistful dialogue, and the tragic beauty of lost love. They argued that Aerith was Cloud's spiritual equal, the one who saw through his false persona, brought out his humility, and shared a bond forged in both life and death. But in Rebirth, Aerith's connection to Cloud, while still present, often felt ethereal and cryptic, less romantic, more prophetic. She speaks in riddles, seems to sense events from alternate timelines, and increasingly behaves like someone who knows she's doomed. Meanwhile, Tifa got screen time. Real, grounded, emotionally rich screen time. Their interactions weren't drenched in metaphor. They were based in shared history, physical closeness, and awkward tension that culminated in that scene at the inn in Gongaga. The infamous did you or didn't you moment, delivered with just enough ambiguity to keep plausible deniability intact, but with very obvious romantic subtext, which sent Clotty shippers into raptures and Clariths into a collective meltdown. Across Reddit, Twitter, Tumblr, and the dark corners of Fandom Discord servers, accusations began flying. People claimed that Square Enix had rewritten canon, that they were pandering to Clotty shippers. One post even declared that Tifa was a narrative distraction, dragging Cloud away from his true soulmate, because clearly the only thing standing between Cloud and spiritual transcendence is a girl who gives him a place to live and makes sure he eats vegetables. The sheer volume of outrage was astonishing. Essays were written, fan theories dissected line by line, developers were at it on social media with demands for justice, and of course Najima's guinea pigs were probably hiding in terror again, waiting for the next wave of romantic death threats. But perhaps the most enduring source of frustration with these new games has been the creeping fear that the trilogy still has no direction. Part 3 hasn't been named, dated, or clearly scoped. The plot continues to spiral into vagueness, and fans who've waited years for closure are beginning to suspect they get none. Instead of a satisfying finale, there's a lingering dread that the final part will deliver more ambiguity, more lore dumps, and more digital shoulder shrugs. In the end, Rebirth didn't just fail to silence the critics, it supercharged them. For every fan who fell in love all over again, another walked away confused, disappointed and mildly traumatized by a piano playing minigame. And the worst part, most of us are still going to buy part 3 anyway, because like Cloud, we're emotionally broken and don't know how to walk away. However, that won't prevent many from continuing to be abusive online. In January 2025, Square Enix dropped the corporate equivalent of a tactical nuke, the Group Customer Harassment Policy. And this wasn't a fluffy PR gesture. This was a legal declaration that said, more or less, if Final Fantasy VII fans continue to abuse our staff, we'll take your games and go home. That's right, the new policy gives Square Enix the explicit right to deny service to fans who cross the line. If you harass an employee, no support. Sent demands for character deaths on Twitter, forget your collector's edition. Bothered someone about affection points? Congratulations, you can go play something else. What's crazier is that this isn't just an empty threat. It's the first time in gaming history that a major publisher has implemented a policy like this, not to protect DRM, not to punish piracy, but to defend their own employees from their own customers. That's how far things have gone. What started as schoolyard bickering has escalated into a corporate safety issue. Final Fantasy VII, a game once known for revolutionising the RPG genre, had made history again, this time for prompting a restraining order against its own fandom. And the message from Square Enix is clear: this is no longer up for debate. At this point you might be wondering, why is it only Final Fantasy VII that's this utterly deranged? After all, every Final Fantasy has had its critics. Final Fantasy XIII was dragged for being a hallway simulator, with characters who monologue too much and battles that allegedly played themselves, but even at its peak controversy, nobody was sending death threats over Lightning's romantic future. Final Fantasy XVI, which dared to go full Devil May Cry with swords, summons and political throat-slitting, has had its share of backlash. Too Western, some cried. Not Final Fantasy enough, but you'll notice something important. No one is trying to cancel Clive's love life on Twitter. There's grumblings for sure, but not trench warfare. So what is it about 7 that turns its fandom into a war zone? The answer, tragically, is everything. Unlike other entries that wrap up neatly, or at least try to, Final Fantasy VII leaves cavernous gaps for players to interpret, or more often, fill with industrial-grade fanon and weaponized emotional investment. It's like Square said, let's give them just enough to go insane, but not enough to ever resolve it. Then there's the early internet factor. Final Fantasy VII dropped at the exact moment forums, fanfiction.net, and GeoCity sites were becoming the lifeblood of fandoms. It wasn't just a game, it was the game people built their first online identity around. While other Final Fantasies had fan communities, Final Fantasy VII had Weebrings. And if you don't know what a Weebring is, congratulations, you've already lived a better life than some of us. Add in the transmedia nightmare that was the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, instead of resolving anything, Square Enix spent over a decade releasing spin-offs that contradicted each other like drunk historians. Villains resurrected, timelines blurred, emotional payoffs felt like they were written by 3 separate writers locked in different broom cupboards. Every new release became another ammunition drop in the shipping war, proof finally that your headcanon was gospel and everyone else was an idiot with bad taste. And finally, the kicker, parasocial identity fusion. For many fans, Cloud isn't just a character, they are Cloud. His romantic fate isn't just a story flavour, it's personal validation. Some players see themselves as co-authors, and when the real authors deviate from their vision, it doesn't feel like storytelling to them, it feels like betrayal. So yes, other Final Fantasy games have had drama, criticism, and the occasional tactical backlash, but Final Fantasy VII has something far more combustible, a perfect storm of vague storytelling, formative nostalgia, internet-age tribalism, and deep psychological protection. In short, it was never just about who Cloud loved, it was about who fans needed him to love. Because once a story becomes part of your identity, disagreement doesn't feel like discussion, it feels like an attack. So what have we learned? That fandoms can be a beautiful thing, a community built around shared joy, wild speculation, and pixelated nostalgia. But it can also mutate, become something brittle, obsessive, even dangerous. In a way, the Final Fantasy VII fandom became a mirror of the game itself. Fragmented, conflicted, haunted by ghosts of the past. Some players became heroes, some became villains, and some just wanted to ride the gondola in peace without being told their OTP is canonically bankrupt. But here's the truth. You don't need to win a shipping war to love a story. You don't need to send death threats to protect your childhood. And if your emotional investment in a fictional romance ends with a developer posting a guinea pig and receiving threats in response, then somewhere along the way you became a retard.
Uh-oh, retard alert! Retard alert!
Now it goes without saying, but let's say it anyway, especially for the people wailing into their Aerith body pillows. The Remake trilogy is not to everyone's taste. Some find the narrative changes infuriating, others think the pacing is all wrong, and a not insignificant portion of the fanbase would rather get hit with a braver to the teeth than play another minute of frog chasing side quests. And that's fine. Quite frankly, I for one would still rather have the Remake trilogy than not. Yes, it's messy, yes, it's occasionally maddening, yes, Nomura probably needs to be locked in a room with a whiteboard and a timeline consultant, but it's also ambitious, beautifully made, and packed with fun moments, if you're willing to accept that it's not a one-for-one retelling of the game you fell in love with at age 13. And most importantly, the original Final Fantasy VII still exists, untouched, unbothered, sitting there in its chunky, low poly glory, ready to be replayed, reappreciated, and modded into oblivion. If you hate what Square Enix is doing now, nothing's stopping you from booting up the 1997 version and reminding yourself why it became a classic in the first place. So no, the Remake trilogy hasn't ruined Final Fantasy VII. It's just given us something else to fight about. And if we're being honest, wasn't that always part of the charm anyway? But remember, no matter which camp you fall into, one thing we can all agree on is that cheap games are absolutely brilliant, and through my links down below you can get over 50% off from the original Final Fantasy VII to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. There are deals on every Final Fantasy you can imagine, plus a ton of modern hits like Expedition 33 if you fancy something turn-based but fresh. Click the link in the pinned comment and save yourself some gil. After all, it's the one timeline where you do get rewards for your choices. Happy gaming and cheerio.